They found him dying from poison that could kill 20 men. But this isn't the rescue story you think it is. What happened next shattered an entire territory's understanding of identity and honor, and if you think you know who saved whom, you're dead wrong. Hit subscribe now, because this story will destroy everything you believed about the frontier wars of 1847. The year was 1847, deep in the unforgiving Sonoran Desert of Arizona Territory. The Apache Wars raged across the Southwest like wildfire, turning every canyon into a battlefield and every water source into a potential grave. The desert stretched endlessly under a merciless sun that could bake a man's bones white in days, while the nights brought cold that could freeze the marrow in those same bones. This was a land where survival wasn't just difficult, it was an art form that few whites had mastered, but the Apache had perfected over centuries. Into this hellscape rode Jake Morrison, once the most feared bounty hunter from El Paso to Santa Fe. Now he was nothing more than a broken man with empty pockets, his reputation destroyed by whiskey and a string of failures that had cost innocent lives. His weathered face bore the map of every mistake he'd made, every friend he'd lost, every chance he'd thrown away. The Colt .45 on his hip was his last possession of value, and even that was running low on ammunition. 3 days without food, 2 without water, Jake was riding toward what he assumed would be his final sunset. But fate had other plans when he stumbled upon something impossible. A massive Apache warrior, easily 7 feet tall, convulsing in the grip of a poison so potent it turned his bronze skin pale as moonlight. This wasn't just any Apache, the intricate tattoos covering his arms and chest, the eagle feathers woven into his black hair, the ceremonial war paint still visible beneath the sweat of agony. This was clearly a war chief of immense importance. Someone had wanted him dead badly enough to use a toxin that could fell a grizzly bear. The stakes couldn't have been higher. In Apache culture, the death of such a leader would mean immediate and devastating retaliation against any white settlement within 100 miles. Innocent families would pay the price for this warrior's death, their scalps decorating Apache lances as payment for their chief's life. But saving him might mean something even more dangerous, earning the respect of a people Jake's own government had branded as savage enemies deserving only extinction. What Jake Morrison couldn't have known as he knelt beside that dying giant was that his choice would uncover a secret so profound it would rewrite the very foundations of identity, loyalty, and belonging in the American West. The poison coursing through the Apache's veins was nothing compared to the truth that would soon surface, a truth that would make Jake question everything he thought he knew about family, honor, and the thin line between civilization and savagery. The vultures were already circling when Jake's horse finally refused to take another step. Jake Morrison had seen death in every form the frontier could offer: bullets, arrows, disease, starvation, but nothing like the scene before him now. The massive Apache warrior lay writhing in the sand, his powerful body locked in convulsions so violent they carved trenches in the earth around him. Foam flecked with blood ran from his mouth, and his dark eyes rolled back to show only white. The poison was winning, and from the look of things, it had been winning for hours. Most men would have been dead already, but this giant's constitution was keeping him alive just long enough to suffer every agonizing second. Jake's first instinct was to mount up and ride away, fast. Getting involved with Apache business was a death sentence for any white man, especially one traveling alone. But something held him frozen in his saddle, watching this warrior fight a battle he couldn't possibly win. But what happened next would force Jake to confront the demons he'd been running from for 3 years. Against every survival instinct screaming in his head, Jake found himself dismounting. His father had been a frontier doctor before the cholera took him, and those childhood lessons came flooding back despite the whiskey that had tried to wash them away. The symptoms were unmistakable: the rigid muscles, the respiratory distress, the way the giant's massive hands clawed at his throat. This was oleander poisoning, the desert's most deadly flower transformed into liquid death. Someone had force-fed this warrior enough poison to kill a dozen men, but his incredible size was the only thing keeping him breathing. Jake pulled his last water from his saddlebag and mixed it with salt from his nearly empty provisions. The antidote was simple in theory: flush the toxins, support the heart, keep the airways clear. But administering it to a dying Apache war chief while alone in the desert? That was either the bravest or stupidest thing he'd ever attempted. As he lifted the giant's head to pour the mixture down his throat, Jake caught sight of something that made his blood freeze. The war paint was fading, but the scars underneath told a different story entirely. As Jake worked to save the warrior's life, he couldn't help but notice details that didn't fit the narrative of savage Apache raiders he'd grown up hearing. The giant's hands, though calloused from warfare, bore the telltale marks of someone who'd learned to read and write. His clothing, beneath the traditional Apache elements, showed signs of European tailoring. Most disturbing of all were the scars on his wrists, not from battle, but from shackles. This was no ordinary war chief. This was someone with a foot in both worlds, someone whose story bridged the gap between white and Apache culture in ways Jake couldn't begin to understand. The poison in his system wasn't random violence. It was a calculated assassination attempt by someone who knew exactly who they were trying to kill. Jake continued his desperate medical work, but every detail he noticed raised more questions about the giant's true identity. By sunset, the impossible was happening. The giant Apache was breathing easier. Jake had used every trick his father had taught him and several he'd improvised on the spot. Activated charcoal from his campfire, carefully measured doses of salt water, pressure points that slowed the poison's spread through the massive body. The warrior's convulsions had stopped, his skin was regaining color, and those dark eyes were beginning to focus with intelligence rather than agony. It was the first time in months Jake had felt like he'd succeeded at something that mattered. But success brought new problems. The Apache was conscious enough now to realize he was being helped by a white man who was completely defenseless if the warrior decided to see him as an enemy. Jake kept his hands visible and moved slowly, hoping that the universal language of medicine would bridge the gap between their two worlds. When the giant finally spoke, his first words would shatter everything Jake thought he understood about the situation. "Thank you for saving my life, brother." The words came in perfect, unaccented English that could have been spoken in any Boston drawing room. Jake nearly dropped his water skin in shock. This wasn't the broken English of trading post negotiations or the careful pronunciation of someone who'd learned the language late in life. This was the speech of someone who'd been raised speaking English as naturally as breathing. The giant Apache struggled to sit up, his massive frame still weak but his mind clearly sharp. "My name is Samuel," he continued, the incongruity of the biblical name coming from those Apache features hitting Jake like a physical blow. "Samuel Whitehorse. And I believe someone very close to me just tried to have me murdered." Jake found his voice after several failed attempts. "Whitehorse? That's not an Apache name." The warrior's smile was sad and knowing. "No, it isn't. Just like Samuel isn't an Apache name. But then again, I'm discovering that very little about my life is what I thought it was." Samuel Whitehorse's story emerged like a river breaking through a dam. Born to Apache parents but kidnapped as an infant during a cavalry raid, Samuel had been raised by a missionary family named Whitehorse in California. He'd grown up believing he was an orphaned Apache child saved by Christian charity, educated in white schools, taught to see his own people as savages in need of salvation. For 26 years he'd lived as a bridge between worlds, too Apache for full acceptance in white society, too white educated to understand his birth heritage. But 3 months ago, everything had changed. A dying missionary had confessed the truth on his deathbed. Samuel wasn't just any Apache child. He was the son of Chief Iron Crow, one of the most respected leaders in the Southwest, and his kidnapping had been part of a deliberate strategy to break his father's spirit and his tribe's resistance. The poison, Samuel explained as his strength returned, had come from someone in the missionary community who couldn't afford to have their secrets exposed. Someone who had built their entire reputation on the lie of saving Apache children, when in reality they'd been stealing them. But the most shocking revelation was still to come. "My father is still alive, Jake. And he's been searching for me for 26 years. Samuel's words carried a weight that made the desert air feel heavy. Chief Iron Crow hadn't broken after his son's disappearance. He'd transformed into something far more dangerous. For over 2 decades, he'd been conducting surgical strikes against the exact military units and settlements responsible for Apache child theft, building a network of informants and allies that stretched from Mexico to Colorado. Every random Apache attack that had puzzled military strategists, every settlement that had been warned just in time to evacuate their children, every military patrol that had found their water supplies mysteriously poisoned, all of it had been Iron Crow's methodical campaign to recover stolen Apache children and punish those responsible. The irony is, Samuel continued, his voice growing stronger, I've been helping hunt my own father for the past 5 years. The Missionary Society hired me as a tracker because they knew I could think like both white and Apache. I've been leading cavalry units right to his camps, never knowing I was betraying my own blood. The weight of this revelation settled over both men like a shroud, but Jake sensed there was even more to this story. The assassination attempt wasn't about silencing Samuel, it was about preventing a reunion. As Samuel's mind cleared from the poison's effects, the full scope of the conspiracy became apparent. Someone in the Missionary Society had learned about Iron Crow's search closing in on his son's location. They couldn't afford for the truth to come out, not just about Samuel, but about the systematic child theft operation that had funded their missions for decades. They needed me dead before I could meet my father, Samuel explained, his massive hands clenching into fists. But they also needed it to look like an Apache poisoning. If a savage Apache tracker died from his own people's treachery, it would justify even more aggressive military action against the tribes. Jake was beginning to understand the true scope of what they'd stumbled into. This wasn't just personal revenge, it was the spark that could ignite a war that would consume the entire Southwest. The Missionary Society was willing to sacrifice hundreds of lives to protect their reputation and their funding. But there was one detail Samuel hadn't yet revealed, and it would change everything about Jake's role in this story. The people who poison me aren't strangers, Jake. They're traveling with the Morrison Missionary Caravan. Jake's blood turned to ice. The Morrison Missionary Caravan, led by his own uncle, Reverend Thomas Morrison, the man who'd raised him after his parents died. The man whose disappointment in Jake's failures had driven him to drink, to desperation, to this empty desert where he'd found a dying Apache giant. Samuel watched Jake's face change and nodded grimly. Your uncle has been the architect of the child theft program for 15 years. He's built his entire ministry on the lie of saving Apache souls, when really he's been destroying Apache families. The children who survive the education process become trackers and translators. Those who don't. Samuel's voice trailed off. My God, Jake whispered. That's why you knew my name. You've been tracking my uncle's caravan. For 3 months. And Jake, your uncle knows exactly who you are. The broken nephew who drinks too much, who fails at everything, who's perfect to take the blame when this all comes crashing down. You finding me here wasn't an accident. You were supposed to find my body and be killed by the vengeful Apache who would follow. The full scope of the trap was becoming clear, but Jake still didn't understand his uncle's ultimate goal. Thomas Morrison wasn't just stealing children, he was orchestrating genocide. Samuel's investigation had uncovered records going back 20 years, documenting a systematic program of cultural destruction that made the cavalry's direct warfare look primitive by comparison. Stolen Apache children were being educated until they forgot their language, their customs, their families. Those who adapted became unwitting weapons against their own people. Those who resisted simply disappeared. But the program was evolving. Thomas Morrison had convinced the territorial government that the Apache problem could be solved not through warfare, but through complete cultural extinction. Take the children, erase their identities, and within a generation there would be no more Apache resistance. The military contractors would lose their lucrative Indian fighting contracts, but the missionary societies would gain control over vast territories and their resources. Your uncle is 3 days away from signing a treaty that will legalize large-scale child removal, Samuel explained. Once that happens, every Apache child in the territory becomes fair game. My death was supposed to be the final piece of evidence that Apaches can't be trusted, even when they're civilized. Jake felt the walls of his world crashing down around him, but Samuel wasn't finished. We have maybe 18 hours before my father's warriors find us. Samuel struggled to his feet, his massive frame still weak but his determination absolute. Iron Crow knows I'm here. He's been tracking the missionary caravan for weeks, waiting for the right moment to rescue me. When he arrives and finds evidence of white men, he'll assume I was murdered. Every white settlement within 50 miles will burn. Jake's mind raced through the possibilities. 18 hours to prevent a war that would consume thousands of innocent lives. 18 hours to somehow expose his uncle's conspiracy and save both white and Apache children from destruction. 18 hours to choose between the family that raised him and the justice that demanded action. There's only one way to stop this, Samuel continued. We have to reach the caravan before my father does. We have to force your uncle to confess publicly, in front of witnesses who can't be silenced or discredited. And Jake, we have to be prepared for him to choose war over exposure. The plan that formed between them was desperate, dangerous, and entirely dependent on Jake's ability to face the man who'd shaped his entire life. They rode hard through the night, two unlikely allies racing against time and fate. Samuel, despite his weakened condition, proved to be an extraordinary horseman. His massive frame moved with his mount as if they were a single creature, and his knowledge of desert terrain turned what should have been impossible travel into a deadly efficient pursuit. Jake found himself struggling to keep up, his smaller horse and inferior desert skills tested to their limits. But it wasn't just the physical challenge that pushed Jake to his breaking point. With every mile, he was riding toward a confrontation that would either vindicate his father's memory or destroy everything he'd believed about his family. Samuel, sensing his companion's internal struggle, shared stories of Apache culture that painted a picture radically different from the savage stereotypes Jake had grown up believing. My people don't understand individual ownership of land, Samuel explained as they watered their horses at a hidden spring. But they understand family loyalty in ways that would humble any white man. My father has spent 26 years refusing to give up hope that his son lived. Can you say the same about your uncle's loyalty to you? The question hung in the desert air like an accusation, but Jake was beginning to understand that everything he'd thought he knew about loyalty and family had been built on lies. At dawn, they found the tracks, and evidence of something far worse than they'd imagined. The Morrison missionary caravan's trail was easy to follow, but the story it told made Jake's stomach turn. Mixed in with the wagon wheel ruts were smaller tracks, barefoot children being forced to walk alongside the wagons. Some of the footprints showed evidence of shackles. Others simply disappeared, as if the children making them had collapsed and been left behind. Samuel's face had gone stone cold. 14 children, he said after studying the tracks. All under 10 years old, from the size of these prints. Jake, this isn't just child theft, this is a slave march. They followed the trail to a recent campsite where the evidence became even more damning. Discarded children's clothing, makeshift graves marked only with piles of rocks, and most horrifying of all, documents that had been carelessly thrown into the fire but not completely burned. Samuel pulled out fragments that detailed sale prices for educated Apache servants and shipping manifests for relocated orphans. My God, Jake whispered, finally understanding the full scope of his uncle's operation. He's not just stealing children, he's selling them. But they were about to discover that the worst revelation was still ahead. The caravan came into view just as the first Apache war cries echoed across the desert. Iron Crow had found them first. Through the shimmering heat, Jake could see at least 50 Apache warriors surrounding the missionary caravan, their war paint gleaming in the morning sun. But they weren't attacking, they were waiting. In the center of the circle, a figure that could only be Chief Iron Crow sat motionless on his war horse, his presence commanding absolute stillness from both his warriors and the terrified missionaries. He knows I'm alive, Samuel said quietly. He can sense me. But he doesn't understand why I'm traveling with a white man. Thomas Morrison's voice carried across the desert, high and panicked as he tried to negotiate with warriors who had no intention of talking. Jake could see his uncle clearly now, a small, pale man in black clothing who looked utterly insignificant compared to the Apache war chief studying him with the intensity of a hunting eagle. This is it, Jake said, checking his weapons. Whatever happens next defines who we are. But as they rode down toward the confrontation, Samuel's next words revealed that even now, they didn't understand the full truth. "Jake, there's something I haven't told you about why your uncle wanted me dead." They were close enough now to see individual faces in the standoff, close enough for Jake to recognize his uncle's features contorted with fear and rage. Samuel's voice was barely audible over the sound of their horses' hooves, but his words hit Jake like bullets. "Your parents didn't die of cholera, Jake. They were murdered because your father discovered the child theft operation and threatened to expose it. Your uncle killed his own brother to protect this conspiracy, then raised you to be his scapegoat when everything fell apart." The world seemed to tilt around Jake as the final pieces fell into place. His father's sudden death, his uncle's immediate appearance to care for the orphaned boy, the way Thomas Morrison had always seemed to expect Jake to fail, to become expendable. It had all been planned from the beginning. "He's been waiting 15 years for the right moment to sacrifice you," Samuel continued. "Today was supposed to be that moment. You were supposed to die trying to rescue me from Apache savages, giving him the perfect justification for total war." As they crested the final hill overlooking the standoff, Jake Morrison understood that he wasn't just riding toward a confrontation with his uncle. He was riding toward a reckoning with everything his life had been built on. Jake Morrison and Samuel Whitehorse rode into the circle of Apache warriors like two souls emerging from the underworld itself. The effect was electric. 50 seasoned warriors shifted nervously in their saddles, uncertain whether they were witnessing miracle or trap. Chief Iron Crow's weathered face showed the first crack in 26 years of stone-cold composure as he recognized the massive figure beside the white stranger. Thomas Morrison's reaction was pure terror disguised as outrage. "Jake," he screamed across the desert silence. "Thank God you're alive. These savages have been holding us hostage, but now that you're here with that Apache prisoner, we can—" His voice died as he truly looked at his nephew for the first time. Jake's eyes held none of the familiar shame and desperation. Instead, they burned with the cold fire of absolute certainty. Samuel raised one massive hand, and the entire gathering fell silent. When he spoke, it was in perfect Apache, his voice carrying across the desert like thunder. Jake couldn't understand the words, but he watched Chief Iron Crow's face transform from suspicious hope to overwhelming joy to volcanic rage as his son explained everything that had happened. "Uncle Thomas," Jake called out, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to do. "I know what you did to my parents. I know about the children. And I know you tried to have Samuel murdered to hide your crimes." The missionary leader's mask finally slipped completely. Gone was the righteous man of God who had shaped Jake's childhood. In his place stood something cold and calculating, a predator who had built an empire on stolen lives and broken families. "You ungrateful wretch," Thomas snarled. "I raised you from nothing. I could have let you die with your bleeding heart parents, but I saved you. And this is how you repay me." The confession hung in the air like gunsmoke. Every Apache warrior heard it. Every missionary in the caravan heard it. Most importantly, Chief Iron Crow heard it, and the rage in his dark eyes promised consequences that would echo across the territory for generations. But Samuel stepped forward before his father could act, and what he did next shocked everyone present. Samuel Whitehorse didn't embrace his father or declare war on the missionaries. Instead, he walked directly to the cage wagon where 14 Apache children huddled in chains, their eyes wide with terror and confusion. With his bare hands, he tore the iron bars apart as if they were made of kindling, his massive strength enhanced by righteous fury. "These children will choose," he announced in both Apache and English. "They will choose their names, their families, their futures. No white man will steal their identity. No Apache warrior will force them to forget what they've learned. They are bridges between worlds, just as I am, and they will decide for themselves what that means." It was a solution no one had considered, not assimilation, not warfare, but genuine choice backed by the strength to enforce it. The children began emerging from the wagon, and their reactions revealed the complexity of what cultural theft had done to them. Some ran immediately to the Apache warriors, crying in their native tongue. Others clung to missionary women who had genuinely cared for them. Most stood uncertain between two worlds, needing time to remember who they had been before fear taught them to hide their true selves. Thomas Morrison made one final, desperate play. Drawing a hidden pistol, he aimed not at Samuel or Jake, but at one of the children still emerging from the wagon. "You'll all back down now," he screamed, "or this little savage dies first." He never got the chance to pull the trigger. Jake's shot took him center mass, the Colt .45 speaking with the voice of 15 years of buried rage and betrayed trust. Thomas Morrison died as he had lived, trying to use an innocent child as a shield for his crimes. The silence that followed was profound. Chief Iron Crow approached his son slowly, and the two men, one raised Apache, one raised white, both shaped by loss and betrayal, finally embraced. It was a moment that redefined what family could mean when it transcended blood and culture. But Jake Morrison stood apart